Part 3, November 1774. Rouse every generous, thoughtful mind, the rising danger flee. If you would lasting freedom find, now then abandon tea. Shall we our freedom give away and all our comfort place in drinking of outlandish tea only to please our taste? Forbid it, heaven, let us be wise and seek our country's good, nor ever let a thought arise that tea should be our food. Since we so great a plenty have of all that's for our health, shall we that blasted herb receive, impoverishing our wealth? Adieu, away, O tea, begone, salute our taste no more, though thou art coveted by some who are destined to be poor. India Tea, a colonial protest song. Chapter 9. God's teeth, I will not drink sassafras. Does she think me a savage? Eden McGuire shoved a cup of the Indian herb drink at Nathaniel. Nathaniel managed to bobble the cup and saucer and save it from crashing to the floor. But the hot liquid drenched his new waistcoat and spilled onto Eden's table, just missing a design page of heraldry for a carriage. He winced as the heat soaked to his skin. Bah! Eden waved his hand impatiently. Clumsy fool, mop that up, then go and tell that wenchable wife of mine that I'll have none of this substitute. I don't care that there's a 3 pence tax per pound. I don't care what these ruffians say about protesting British doings in Boston. I want real tea. Where is the liberty they speak of when I can't even choose for myself what to drink of a morning? Nathaniel hurriedly mopped up the spill, ducking to avoid being smacked as Eden threw his hands about in indignation. Eden's temper was poker hot when it flared. This morning it was as scorching as the embers in the blacksmith's forge where Eden's smithy made nails for carriage wheels. Shaking out a copy of the Virginia Gazette, Eden went on. Listen to the association resolves of this so-called Continental Congress. They call themselves most dutiful, loyal subjects of the king, while calling on us to defy him. Do they really think that by our not drinking tea or refusing to buy English goods, the greatest empire in the world is going to bow down and change? They obviously know naught of the lobster backs. They ought to talk to my Irish countrymen to know what comes of challenging the British crown and its soldiers. I came to this land to be free of such suicidal argument. He threw the broadsheet newspaper to the ground. Where am I to purchase the gold leaf I need to gild my carriages, if not from British merchants? I will be ruined. These madmen want us to make our own homespun cloth, and he spluttered, picked up the paper to find the exact wording. He read with heavy sarcasm, and to engage in frugality, economy, and industry, discouraging any display of extravagance. Why, that could include my magnificent work, since riding in one of my carriages makes a man appear an earl. And look here, next summer, if the British don't do our bidding, we will stop exporting our goods to them. Everything but rice. That means every tobacco planter in Virginia could end up in the poorhouse. My business will die. He slammed the paper to the table. Sticking out his lower lip, he glared at Nathaniel. Then you'll be out in the streets, boy, back where you came from, and you, and you, and you as well. Eden pointed at Ben, then at John Hunter, an indentured servant, and finally at Obadiah Puryear, a journeyman in the trade. The 2 men worked in Eden's shop in the many stages required to complete a carriage. Ben helped them finish projects, actually doing some of the work under their watchful eyes. Nathaniel had inherited all Ben's grunt labor, sweeping, stoking fires, sharpening tools, and caring for the horses and chickens. Nathaniel stood silently, never quite sure when Eden's tirades were over and he should go about his commands. Walk away too soon, and Eden would grab him by the collar. Well, Eden roared, throwing up his hands. What are you waiting for? He stood up from his chair. Return straightaways. I need you to crank the wheel for the lathe. We need to carve this piece of elm into a hub today. I've an order for a phaeton from a well-off gentleman, whom I trust will pay speedily. Grumbling, he picked up the slab of wood. Nobody can do anything around here without my telling him. When I was a journeyman in Dublin, now there's a city, I was grateful to work. I used to—" Nathaniel scrambled for the door. As he passed, Ben crossed his eyes and pulled down his mouth with his fingers to make a grotesque face at Eden's turned back. Nathaniel couldn't believe how reckless Ben was. But even John was rebellious in mood that morning and whispered to Nathaniel, "Don't worry, lad. They don't call him the Palace Street Puffer for nothing." "What? What did you say, scurvy scoundrel?" Eden shouted, turning around. He slammed the hunk of wood down. "I'll not tolerate any gossiping among you rabble." "We just told him to a hurry, master," answered John in a sing-song voice. "Bah!" barked Eden. Nathaniel bolted for the safety of the kitchen before he could be questioned. If Eden really pushed him to know what John had said, Nathaniel would have to tell. If he didn't tell, Eden would shake it out of him. He'd hate to get John into trouble. Nathaniel liked John, but better it be John than Nathaniel. Being in trouble with Eden was a deep and wide chasm that Nathaniel would do anything to avoid. So Nathaniel ran, clutching the teacup and spilling more tea all over his waistcoat. Inside the warm outbuilding, he found the most revered servant of the household, Sally the slave cook. Her status came partly from her formidable bearing, partly from her close relationship with Eden's wife, but mainly from the delicious food she created and her frank wisdom. She was plucking a chicken, making a little pile of downy feathers. Mrs. Elizabeth McGuire stood beside, holding a book titled The Complete Housewife. Before he could say anything, she spoke with a sigh. I know, I heard him." Mrs. McGuire shook her head. "Everyone this side of the governor's palace could probably hear him. More's the pity. Here we are among the gentles he hopes to befriend, and there he is, sounding like a fishmonger. What must our neighbors think?" She put her hand to her cheek, flushed with dismay. "Well, it's not as if that Mr. Wythe isn't a bit odd himself now, is it? Taking a bath daily. Imagine!" She checked a small kettle hanging over the fire. "I've already started a pot of chocolate for him, Nathaniel, to replace the sassafras." She stirred something else in the fireplace and took a sip of it from the ladle, wrinkling her nose. "The sack whey is ready for Mr. Wilkinson, though. All it needs is hartshorn spirits." She added a few drops from a small vial and stirred. "This should cure that cold." Nathaniel knew Basil would not be happy to receive Mrs. McGuire's sack whey. The elixir of wine, watery milk, and distilled slices of deer antler was disgusting. But she'd read in her book that the way to stop a cold was to lie much in bed and drink such concoctions. She was determined to get him well quickly, and Basil wanted to avoid being bled by a surgeon. "I can't stand being cut," he moaned. "Last time they took a whole cup of my blood to balance my humors, so I'll try her remedies. Besides, I'd not hurt Mistress McGuire's feelings for the world. She is very kind." She was that, a tiny woman, not much taller than Nathaniel. Mrs. McGuire was quiet and thoughtful. She wasn't exactly pretty or dignified. There were too many worries etched into her face for that. Underneath her mob cap, her graying hair was thin and stringy, but she watched to see what people needed and then silently provided it. A matter-of-fact kindness that bred beauty of a sort. A few weeks after Nathaniel arrived at her house, a set of clothes and a pair of shoes appeared beside the rolled-up straw mattress he used in the stable's hayloft. She'd recently given him the waistcoat as protection against the November chill. He looked down at the striped wool and was relieved to see that the wet spots were drying. He'd hate for her to think he was careless with her gifts. She glanced up shyly at her, but her back was turned. After 6 months in her household, Nathaniel had come to recognize that her generosity was not born of an outgoing personality or the beginnings of affection. It was more the simple decency someone might show in taking in a stray dog. Starved for care, it was enough for Nathaniel. Had she been more warm and loving, like his mother, it would have torn his heart out. Mrs. McGuire pulled the chocolate off the fire. "Basil, Mr. Wilkinson has asked me about your sleeping on the floor in his room now that the weather is turning. I told him that it is acceptable. The nights will soon be frigid, but you must keep to your morning stable chores, Nathaniel, without fail." She turned and caught him watching her. As always, Nathaniel averted his eyes. "Look at me, lad. I want to make sure you hear me well." She smiled when he obeyed, but she said pointedly, "Mr. McGuire will not like it if you're late with the horse's oats." "Aye, mistress, I will not fail." Sleep in the house? Yet another privilege he had not dreamed of. He was so afraid that it would all disappear or reveal itself to be a trap of some kind. He tasted meat, mutton, bacon, beef, or salted fish several times a week. He had a pair of shoes and bedding to sleep on. Nathaniel distrusted it all. He couldn't help it. He was almost glad of Eden's temper, which kept his life rooted to what he had known the past 2 years, unending labor and unpredictable punishment. "Please take this upstairs to Mr. Wilkinson." Mrs. McGuire handed the sackway to Nathaniel. "I'll take this cup of chocolate out to my husband. I need talk with him about this non-importation agreement. There is much pressure for Williamsburg's merchants and shopkeepers to sign their names to it. We must do so as well. County committees will check merchants' books to make sure we stick to the ban on imports. The threat is if we purchase or sell any British goods, they will print an ad in the Gazette telling townsfolk to break off all dealings with us. We cannot afford to be shunned." She turned to Sally and confided, perhaps forgetting Nathaniel's presence. "Mr. McGuire's debt is large. We owe £700 for this house. He thought our fortune would be made by following Lord Dunmore to Williamsburg from New York City when the King made Dunmore royal governor here. Eden was convinced the Virginians would be so impressed by the coaches he made for Lord Dunmore that they would flock to our workshop. He insisted on moving us to Palace Street to make our association with the governor clear. We had no need for such a large house." Clucking in sympathy, Sally kept at her work. Mrs. McGuire rubbed her forehead. "He is a fine carriage maker, that he is. He is right to take pride in himself, but—" She looked out the door toward the shop in back of the garden. "But things have not worked out as planned, and now our Williamsburg neighbors might not like the fact he's done so much work for Lord Dunmore. Eden must come to understand that, otherwise we could lose everything." She picked up the tray with the pot of chocolate and squared her shoulders. Sally stopped plucking to warn. "Have a care, mistress." "Aye," Mrs. McGuire replied quietly. "That I will." Chapter 10. Nathaniel pushed open the door to Basil's bedchamber, carefully holding the steaming and smelly sackway. Basil was sitting cross-legged under the window, his gray hair down upon his shoulders, nightcap askew, reading a book in the sunlight. When he heard the door creak, he scrambled to his feet in a comical bolt of bare legs and flapping pages. He might be old, but he was spry. He was on his feet and running for the bed in an instant. But he stopped with an embarrassed snort. "Oh, 'tis only you, Nathaniel. Methought it was Mistress McGuire. She has disciplined me severely when she found me out of bed. But I simply cannot resist Gulliver's Travels. I have come to the part where Gulliver is about to—" Basil breathlessly pointed to a passage, when he stopped himself abruptly. "Oh, forgive me, lad. I have read ahead of where you and I are. I shan't spoil it for you." He looked a bit ashamed. "But just wait, Nathaniel. It is so exciting. We'll read again tonight, shall we? Imagine creating a whole universe of little people and naming the nation Lilliput. Where in the world did Swift get that name? Where does a writer come up with such wonderful nonsense?" Basil sighed with delight. Back in the hot nights of August, when the air felt as if you could sear Nathaniel's lungs, Basil had sat on the back steps to read in the long summer twilight. He'd called Nathaniel out of the stable and read aloud Robinson Crusoe. The novel was about a spoiled young man who'd been stranded on a desert island for 28 years, only to find a remarkable courage and resourcefulness inside himself. Nathaniel had never before heard stories other than those in the Bible. He would close his eyes and could almost see Crusoe being swept ashore by the raging sea, teaching his parrot Poll to talk, saving the man Friday. The words made such powerful pictures. As Basil read, a door opened to a world Nathaniel had not known existed. But perhaps the most amazing new universe had been the music. The music! Basil was gone most days, tallying numbers for storekeepers, teaching in homes about the cities, repairing musical instruments, but he had still found time to keep his promise to teach Nathaniel to play the German flute. Nathaniel had surprised himself by learning quickly. The fingerings were easy. All fingers went down over the flute's holes for low C. Then the player basically walked up the instrument to go up the scale, lifting one finger at a time, starting with the right pinky. But balancing it was awkward. The German flute's mouthpiece was held underneath the lips, and then the length of it went up and out to the right. The real difficulty was blowing strongly enough down into the mouthpiece to make a note sound. It took a huge amount of air. Countless times Nathaniel had almost swooned. But now Nathaniel was actually making melody. So far, Basil had taught him 3 tunes. Basil played and Nathaniel mimicked. When Basil said, "You have an amazing ear, lad, to learn these songs so quickly," Nathaniel had bloomed with pride. He couldn't remember how long it had been since he had taken pleasure in a task. When nightmares about the voyage over the Atlantic or the treatment at the plantation haunted him, Nathaniel simply replayed those melodies in his mind to chase away the ghosts of fear. Nathaniel knew that was why Mrs. McGuire was fussing so over Basil's cold. He had given her the same gift with the spinet. Through open windows, Nathaniel had heard her playing the small harpsichord that Basil had brought back from the plantation. She'd stumbled and banged through the summer, but now she was working on a hornpipe, where the melody was clear and delicate. She heard Basil encourage, "Yes, my dear, that is excellent." Afterward, Mrs. McGuire had come to the workshop with a radiant smile. "Come hear what I've learned, Mr. McGuire." "I've not time for idle entertainment, mistress," he snarled. "You browbeat me into buying that spinet for you. I did so. I've taken this puny boy in exchange for your lessons. Need I do more?" Her smile had disappeared. So had she. Mrs. McGuire walked back into the house and played and played and played. Nathaniel shook his head to toss off his daydreaming. "Too close. You are getting too fond of this old man," Nathaniel warned himself. "Your own father deserted you. This old man can too." He squelched his burning desire to ask what was happening to Gulliver in the land of the Lilliputians. Instead, he held out the cup of sack whey. The stench of it wafted toward Basil. His face fell. "Oh, must I, lad? It is so wretched. I drank the whole lot of it yesterday." He pouted and kept his hands to his side. Nathaniel pushed the cup at Basil. "Ah, me!" Basil took it, held his nose, and swallowed. "Oh, horrible!" He took another gulp. "Oh, could hemlock be any worse?" He managed a 3rd swig, his face contorted like a gargoyle's. Gagging and coughing, he spluttered, "That's enough! Enough, I say!" He lifted the lid of his chamber pot, releasing another stench into the air to pour the remainder in. "That's where it belongs." He closed it back up and turned to Nathaniel. "Nathaniel, lad, may you never be so blessed with a woman's good intentions." He sank onto the bed, his face pale from the ordeal of taking his medicine. Nathaniel made for the door. "Lad," Basil held up his hand to stop him. "Aye, master? I wish to speak to you about Ben." Nathaniel waited. "He reports you avoid his company." Nathaniel frowned but said nothing. He didn't avoid him exactly, but when Ben asked him to travel at twilight to meet his friends, Nathaniel did hang back. Ben was very likable, but he was such a risk-taker. Eden had whipped Ben more than once for smelling of ale. 2 years older than Nathaniel and tall for his age, Ben, at 15, could slip into the taverns and talk protest. As much as he was drawn to Ben's playful personality, Nathaniel wasn't about to join in those dangerous doings. "I know he is a bit of a rustabout, but he has a good soul, lad," Basil coaxed, seeming to read Nathaniel's thoughts. "Ben's circumstances are confusing for him. He has several childhood friends at the College of William and Mary. His family was middling gentry. They owned a small farm, and his father made additional money as a joiner, building houses, fences, cabinets. But his father died. Without the income of his father's craft, Ben's mother was unable to keep their family together. Thinking carriage-making would be a steady industry, she apprenticed Ben to Eden. But Ben clearly chafes at the assignment. Although he is a mediocre student at best, I think he longs to be talking patriot philosophy with college scholars." Nathaniel nodded. "Aye, master, I understand." He had sensed Ben's frustration. Basil pushed a little harder. "'Twould do you good, Nathaniel, to have a friend." Nathaniel froze. He had had a friend, Moses, and Moses had been ripped away from him. Since coming to Williamsburg, he'd searched every African face that passed by. It seemed half the city's residents were black. He kept hoping to find Moses somewhere. He'd even slipped away to the market square to see if one of the carts coming in from outlying plantations carried him. But he'd never found him. It made his heart ache thinking of it. Nathaniel's silence discouraged Basil from further prodding. "Well," he murmured, clearly disappointed, "we shall read on tonight after your chores, yes?" Nathaniel nodded, keeping his eyes down and his face blank. But inside, as much as he hated to admit it, he could hardly wait for sundown to visit the Lilliputians. Chapter 11. A week later, Eden Maguire stood on the lawn of the Capitol arguing with the most revered man of Williamsburg, Speaker Peyton Randolph. Even Nathaniel could see that Eden was making a fool of himself. One of the richest and best educated men in the colony, Randolph had just come home from Philadelphia, where he had been chosen president of the Continental Congress. Calm, tactful, and cautious, Randolph listened to radicals like Patrick Henry and his own cousin, Thomas Jefferson, but he kept Virginia's official protests polite, designed to bring about repeal of British taxes and to restore good relations with the king. Williamsburg newspapers were calling him the father of American liberty. Randolph was at the Capitol that cool November day along with hundreds of merchants and planters promising to not sell or use any British goods. While Eden ranted, a dozen townspeople stood nearby waiting to talk with Randolph. A short distance away was a table to which man after man stepped, took up a pen, and signed the association resolves. A gentleman overseeing the process shook the hand of each man as he signed. Observers clapped him on the back in congratulations. The crowd inside the high brick walls of the Capitol yard was growing and getting louder each minute. Not heeding how many people were listening, Eden blundered on. "But how can the people of Williamsburg so abuse Lord Dunmore when he's just won a war against the Shawnee Indians and claimed all the territory south of the Ohio River for Virginians to settle?" Eden's face was red. He leaned way too close to Randolph. Taking a slight step back, Randolph pulled a lace handkerchief from the wide sleeve of his floral frock coat and held it to his nose. Even by the city standards, Eden's odor was strong. Nathaniel had seen many a lady hold a nosegay up to her face when he passed. "These resolves have nothing to do with Governor Dunmore," Randolph replied evenly. "They are directed to Parliament to convince it to stop this unconstitutional taxation of us. They do not tax Englishmen at home without representation, nor should they us. We have made humble and reasonable petitions to the Crown. Our letters have been treated with contempt by His Majesty's ministers. We cannot sit idly. Participating in our government, protesting actions we do not like, are fundamental rights of Englishmen. And we are Englishmen, even though we live in the colonies. And so—" "Peaceably," Eden interrupted. "Do you find boarding the ship of a man who has long been good to the planters of this colony and dumping his cargo into the York River peaceable, sir?" He referred to a tea party 2 days earlier. Following the example of Boston, about 20 men boarded a merchant ship docked in nearby Yorktown. They threw 2 half-chests of tea from England overboard. The ship's merchant, John Prentice, had printed a groveling apology on the same day. The local committee of safety issued a statement that anyone who broke the embargo should be made to feel the resentment of the public. Pointing his thumb toward the Duke of Gloucester Street, Eden went on. "Someone has to put a liberty pole outside the Raleigh Tavern. On it hangs a bag of feathers and beneath it is a barrel of tar. Is that to frighten me into signing this association? Aren't you, sir, being just as coercive as you claim Parliament to be?" "Hear, hear!" applauded one of those awaiting Randolph, a portly man in a plush burgundy coat, an obvious loyalist. "Fie, man, for shame!" cried another. "Such talk makes you an enemy of American liberty." 2 other men took steps forward, one growling. Perhaps Mr. Maguire should be the first to taste of tar and feathering. "Peace, peace, gentlemen, peace!" Randolph held up his hand. "We must not argue among ourselves. It is important that we make a united stand. That way we will convince His Majesty to repeal these offensive acts. We did the same to protest the Stamp Act, and it worked." "Aye, that and a little bit of fright put to the stamp collector," whispered one listener to another, who laughed. Randolph continued, "Mr. Maguire, these resolves call for non-importation, non-consumption, non-exportation, in short, shutting down trade between us and England, getting them in their purse. It is the most speedy, effective, and peaceable way to show Parliament we mean what we say. When they see how determined we are, They will have to repeal these oppressive acts. Then we can return to a calm and loving state with our sovereign king. Representatives you elected agree to these resolves for you. We are bound by honor and love of our country to follow them. Good day, sir." He bowed his head in courtly fashion and turned away. The knot of men followed, save one who hissed, "Be forewarned, Maguire. Those who are not with us will definitely be seen as against us." He left, looking over his shoulder threateningly. Eden stayed rooted, breathing hard in anger, but after a few moments his coloring changed from red to chalky white. He hung his head, mumbling about bankruptcy and backwater tyranny. He shuffled off to join the line of signers. Basil, Ben, and Nathaniel had watched the scene. "Mistress Maguire will not be happy to hear of her husband's tantrums," said Basil. "That made him at least 10 enemies." "Not that he doesn't already have a host of them," quipped Ben. "I've been asked to keep an eye on him and report any disloyal acts of consuming British goods." Alarmed, Basil turned to Ben. "Report him? To whom?" "To a few patriot gentlemen who have taken an interest in our ill-tempered carriage-maker," answered Ben. "They are like to be on the committee of inspection to be elected next month." "Ben, lad," Basil shook his head, "he who asks you to pry into your master's doings and spread gossip is no gentleman." Ben grinned. "I didn't say I was planning on fulfilling the request, Master Tutor, but—" He looked at Nathaniel meaningfully. "It would feel good, wouldn't it, to stick it to the old curmudgeon? A little payback for those whippings?" "Ben!" "Oh, don't worry. You taught me better than that, old sir. I'm no Brutus." A passing youth caught Ben's eye. "Oh, look, if I'm not mistaken, there goes James Monroe. I knew him at home. I heard he was coming to the college." "Nice lad." He darted off. "James! James!" Basil watched him go. "I worry about that boy," he muttered, but he brightened suddenly. He remembered about Caesar and Brutus. A miracle! Mayhap I did teach him something. Now there's a story of conceit and betrayal I must tell you, Nathaniel. Back in the time of Rome. A gust of cold wind rattled the trees and shook out the remaining autumn leaves in a tumble of crimson and gold. Basil began to cough violently. Nathaniel wanted to tell him to return home to bed. "Mistress Maguire's remedies are foul and only so effective," Basil gasped through his coughs. A girl touched Basil's sleeve. "Posset drink might help with that cough," she said. "You curdle milk and ale and flavor it with sugar and spices. That's what Mother gave us." Basil straightened up. "Ah, Miss Rind." He bowed his head and made formal introduction. "Nathaniel, this is Miss Maria Rind, daughter of the publishers of the Virginia Gazette. First her father and then her mother, Clementina. I have oft placed advertisements in their broadside about my teaching. Maria, this is Nathaniel Dunn, my—" He paused, considered, and said, "a fellow musician." Maria put her feet into a V and curtsied at the knee. Nathaniel had no idea what to do. "Like this, Nathaniel," Basil whispered. He placed one foot in front of the other, bent with the back knee, and bowed his body over his right arm. "It's to show the young lady what a well-muscled leg you have," he teased. Maria giggled. Awkwardly, his face flaming in embarrassment, Nathaniel made the formal greeting. "Don't worry," Maria told him. "There are lots of things I'm supposed to know how to do that I do not." She paused a moment to think. "My penmanship is awful," she offered. Grateful, Nathaniel nodded. "Mother simply did not have the time to teach me after Father died and she took up the press." "I am sorry for the recent loss of your mother," said Basil. "She was a brave lady. Look around you, Maria. Much of today's patriotism is a result of what your mother was courageous enough to print." Maria's smile was a mix of pride and sadness. "Yes, she was very strong." Basil explained to Nathaniel, who burned with new embarrassment that he knew nothing of this obviously important printer. Burgess Thomas Jefferson wrote an eloquent defense of our rights in August called A Summary View of the Rights of British America. Mr. Randolph presented it to the House of Burgesses to adopt, but it was too revolutionary for its members. It said that because we had established these colonies through our own hard work, we had the right to make our own laws without Parliament's interference. Mr. Jefferson said that government must be honest and that it exists only through the consent of the people. He wrote that God gave us liberty at the same time he gave us life. Stirring words, yes? But then he went on to say, and this is what many felt bordered on treason, that the king was no more than a chief officer of the people, obligated to serve our best interests. Therefore, he was subject to our will. Most people were afraid of those words, but not Mrs. Rind. She printed them, and because she did, Thomas Jefferson's ideas traveled throughout the colonies. They were reprinted in cities as far away as Philadelphia. The resolves that these merchants are signing today bear the mark of Mr. Jefferson's belief in our ability and right to govern ourselves. It is strange, is it not, that a man who so stumbles when he speaks can write so beautifully? I hear it was the same with his courtship of Mrs. Jefferson. Completely tongue-tied, but won her heart through his violin playing. Basil put his hand over his heart. I never had the opportunity to play with Mr. Jefferson. He was a student of Francis Alberti. He and his cousin John Randolph are the best violinists in the city. I wish... Basil was about to wander off into one of his stories, but Maria interrupted. Thank you for your kind words, Mr. Wilkinson. Mother would be pleased by them. Although a woman, she was a bold believer in liberty. Maria sighed. I wish I could stay to hear them read the resolves, but I best collect my younger brothers before they get into trouble. They left the house without asking. The littlest is only 4 years old. I hope you will do us the favor of more advertisements, sir. My cousin John Pinckney will continue printing our paper. We children are to stay with him. She curtsied once more to Nathaniel. I hope we meet again, she said shyly. Pale, with solemn dark eyes, Maria was pretty, probably a year younger than his 13 years. Nathaniel hesitated. Basil elbowed him, and Nathaniel clumsily bowed again as she left. Nathaniel hadn't managed to speak one word. Maria was a recent orphan, yet she had the graciousness to be kind to both Basil and him. He began to feel ashamed of the way he always held himself in. On the walk home, Nathaniel decided to do something he knew would please Basil. Master, can you explain more about what Thomas Jefferson wrote? Basil lit up like a firefly in the summer. Oh, Jefferson was undoubtedly influenced by John Locke and Alexander Pope. These are English philosophers who believe that by nature man is born free and good with the right and the ability to choose his own course. And rather than being afraid that we will blunder, Locke and Pope believe man has a sense of reason that will guide him to make the right moral decisions. We are not in need of higher authorities. In fact, those higher authorities, kings, the church, are often corrupt and foolish. Man's God-given common sense is the best ruler of our actions. Each man is capable of learning and directing his own destiny. Laws of the land should be tailored to allow him to do so. This concept of man's capabilities is new, revolutionary, dignifying all of us with an inborn intelligence before only thought to belong to kings, lords, priests, and the mighty. Basil stopped walking and put his hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. It includes you, Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at the old tutor blankly. Basil patted his shoulder and repeated, That includes you, lad. Believe it. No, he had spent so much time being directed by others that he had no faith in himself or in any promise of freedom. Basil's words rung like a distant bell in Nathaniel's head, but he couldn't yet heed its call.